Good day. The big news on the Ukrainian battlefields continues to be the big Russian advance in the north part of the front lines in Kharkiv region, with the Russians now having crossed the Zherebets River west of Kremenaya and apparently pushing towards the latest Ukrainian fortified positions, which it turns out is on an area of high ground just east of the Oskol River. I discussed this advance yesterday, the fact that it seems to have been rapid, the fact that it looks as if there's been some disorganization on the part of the Ukrainian defenses in this area, and also the fact that if the Russians do reach the Oskol River in this area, it will affect the position of the Ukrainian defenders in the town of Liman to the south and in the town of Kupiansk to the north, with other Russian forces unrelated to the forces engaged in this particular advance also steadily closing in both on Kupiansk and Liman. That is the major battle that's been going on the front lines. Ukraine has made various claims that it has made some small gains, as it puts it, near the village of Staromayorsk, which is on the Vremevsky Ledge on the southern front lines. I take that as a further admission that it has not, in fact, captured Staromayorsk, and that, in fact, the situation on the Vremevsky Ledge remains essentially unchanged. And there have been further Ukrainian attacks, apparently, south of Orekhov towards Rabotino. I discussed those yesterday, and also around the Pyatikhatki area. And again, those attacks, there have been attacks there as well. And all of these attacks near Rabotino and near Pyatikhatki seem to have been defeated with heavy losses. Now, Russian officials are starting to say that there's been a change, a noticeable change, in one respect, in the way in which the Ukrainian military is acting on the battlefields. Firstly, they're attacking with smaller forces, but secondly, especially on the southern battlefields, there's larger numbers of Ukrainian troops apparently handing themselves in, surrendering to the Russians. And this is now starting to become more than just a trickle, but it's still significantly less than a flood. But there are increasing reports of more and more Ukrainian troops surrendering, and the Russian Ministry of Defense has published videos of some of these soldiers being interrogated. I'm not going to comment on anything that these soldiers say, by the way. These Ukrainian soldiers who have been taken captive or who have surrendered, I think it's wrong to do so. I'm not sure I even agree with the practice the Russian Ministry of Defense has of showing television film or video film of the interrogations and statements of these soldiers. But I'm not going to discuss this. I'm not an expert in this area of war crimes law, if this is even a war crime, which I doubt, by the way. But regardless of that, I'm not going to discuss the contents of these videos. What I will say is that there have been apparently a cascade of complaints from Ukrainian military units communicated back to their headquarters and made public in Ukraine. Now, I remember that a great deal of this was going on in the summer of last year, especially at the time of the fighting in and around the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And at that time, there were complaints from Ukrainian soldiers about the fact that they were being poorly led, that they were being thrown into what were essentially suicide assaults, and there were also some complaints from their families in Ukraine. And then there were the successful Ukrainian offensives in Kharkov and Kherson regions, successful in the sense that they did recover a great deal of ground, even though, as I've discussed many times, the strategic consequences of those advances have been overstated, and Ukrainian losses over the course of these offensives were extremely high. But nonetheless, it's clear that the effect of those offensives was to restore morale amongst the Ukrainian military, and basically these complaints from soldiers in army units and this trickle of essentially deserters, people giving up the battle and going over to the Russians, that, of course, essentially stopped at this time. Now it has resumed, not, I think, yet on the scale that we saw in the spring and summer of 2022, but it does look to be a growing trend. One of the most plaintive statements by one of these Ukrainian units is of a Ukrainian brigade on the west bank of Kherson region near the Antonovsky Bridge. And this is the brigade, I presume, which has been most heavily involved in sending troops across the Dnieper River, trying to establish a bridgehead on the east bank. Now, Russian officials recently said that around 900 Ukrainian troops were killed in this fighting, and it's also the case that this particular Ukrainian brigade has been subjected to continuous shelling and bombing by the Russian military. And anyway, there's said to be a video circulating of soldiers from this brigade complaining about the fact that they've been given an impossible mission to carry out, and that the brigade is now down to 20% of its regular number. Now, I stress again, I haven't seen this video. Again, I find watching videos of this kind particularly difficult, but that is what apparently these Ukrainian soldiers are saying. Since I'm on the topic of Kherson region, I should say that there was another destruction in Kherson region of a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile battery, and interestingly, this also appears to have been located relatively close to the Antonovsky Bridge, and apparently this was the French Aspide system. Some people have referred to it as the French equivalent of the Russian S-300 system and the American Patriot system. Anyway, France and Italy supplied Ukraine with, I think, one brigade each of these supposedly advanced missiles. I've heard quite a lot about the effectiveness of this missile system. Some French sources say that it is more advanced even than the Patriot itself is. And unlike the Patriot, it uses two different types of surface-to-air missiles. Well, it has been destroyed, apparently, in a drone attack. I understand, once again, those deadly Lancet drones, these kamikaze drones that the Russians have not only perfected in terms of their design, but perfected in terms of their deployment, caught up with this system and overwhelmed it and destroyed it. And again, there are pictures and film of this. This is copies, by the way, an incident that took place a couple of weeks ago when an S-300 missile system, one of the few S-300 missile systems that Ukraine has left, was also destroyed in Kherson region, but some further distance away from the battlefront. So this is supposedly an advanced Western surface-to-air missile system, and it has been destroyed, and presumably it was located where it was in order to provide cover to the Ukrainian soldiers near the Antonovsky Bridge, the very soldiers who are complaining that their brigade is now down to only 20% of its regular total. Anyway, it was presumably intended to provide air defense for those soldiers, and it has now been destroyed. This whole attempt to establish a bridgehead close to the Antonovsky Bridge has been, in my opinion, another debacle. It took a long time for the Russians to get on top of the situation, and to some extent I think the Russians found that embarrassing. I've explained why the Ukrainians might have been able to establish a bridgehead in this area in the first place. The west bank of the Dnieper is higher than the east bank. That means that Russian forces and their fortifications, their fortified lines, are some distance from the banks of the Dnieper River. And that does leave a small area of ground between the riverbank and the Russian fortifications, which the Ukrainians could, in theory, occupy and convert into a bridgehead. The Russians, before the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, had heavily mined this area, but a lot of those mines, well, all of those mines, were washed away when the dam was destroyed. But anyway, it took the Russians a while to get on top of this problem. There may, for all I know, still be some Ukrainian troops clinging on to some of the weekend cottages in an area known as the Dacha area, which is located close to the riverbank. But very high losses have been incurred by Ukraine. For little obvious gain, it's quite clear that no bridgehead has been established, and if there are any Ukrainian troops still clinging on, frankly, their position must be becoming increasingly desperate. So anyway, that's the situation. I should say that in terms of the fighting on the front lines in the south, Putin and Lukashenko had a very interesting exchange over the course of their discussion in St. Petersburg, which I spoke about the other day, when they talked about the dangers of a conflict with Poland. Anyway, Lukashenko said that in one particular attack in the Rabotino area, he had established that 15 Leopard 2s and no fewer than 20 Bradleys were destroyed in the fighting. That's on one specific day. And reading what Lukashenko actually said, it's fairly clear to me that he was not talking about the fighting in June. He was talking about one of the more recent battles. Now, one thing makes me a little careful about accepting this claim, which is that reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense have never spoken about the destruction of so many Western armored vehicles, identified Western armored vehicles, 15 Leopard 2s and 20 Bradleys on one specific day in the recent fighting. So I do wonder about the precise accuracy of this claim by Lukashenko, but Putin didn't contradict it, and in fact he seemed to suggest that if anything, Ukrainian losses were even greater than Lukashenko was talking about, and Putin and Lukashenko's comments were anyway obviously carefully prearranged. Maybe Lukashenko, exuberant personality as he is, went off-piste in some places, but overall it's clear to me that these comments were carefully planned in advance just as the earlier comments the previous day between at the Security Council between Putin and Narishkin, where they also discussed the Polish situation, were also prearranged. And presumably, I'm guessing now, but presumably Lukashenko was primed to mention the extent of the losses that have taken place in this part of the battlefield. Anyway, there we go. I just mentioned that. One Russian journalist, a man called Sladkov, may have got his name wrong. Fairly well-known journalist, by the way. Anyway, he is saying that in the current fighting, since this offensive began, in effect, Ukraine has been losing in terms of men dead and wounded on any particular day in the battlefronts, the equivalent of a battalion a day. And if you base your estimates of Ukrainian losses on the reports of the Russian Defense Ministry, and let me reiterate again, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Defense Minister, said in a recent meeting with Putin that the Russians estimate Ukrainian losses on the basis of radio intercepts of what the Ukrainian ground commanders are reporting back to the General Staff in Kiev or to their superiors. Anyway, Shoigu, if you accept, as I said, these Russian estimates of losses, of Ukrainian losses, that is about right. A battalion a day. And obviously, that is unsustainable. We will come to that in a moment. But there are more things to discuss on the battlefronts. Now, I've spoken about the southern battlefronts, I've spoken about the northern battlefronts, but it's clear that there's been very intense fighting overnight again in the Bakhmut area, with Ukraine making a further attempt to push through towards Kleshchayevska, this hotly contested village to the southwest of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. And the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, or to be more precise, the official Ukrainian news agency, has said that the Ukrainians were able to knock the Russians out of their positions in a village some way to the south of Kleshchayevska called Andreevka. And there have been other reports to that effect. There were suggestions that at one point that the Ukrainians have now occupied part of Andreevka. Other suggestions that they're not actually in occupation of Andreevka, that the village is essentially in the grey zone, and inevitably, and to a great extent, there's lots of commentary, lots of discussion about what this all means, whether the eventual capture of Andreevka will necessarily lead to the fall of Kleshchayevka further north, whether the road that connects Artyomovsk, Bakhmut in other words, with Donetsk city would be threatened if being cut off if Kleshchayevka were to fall, whether the Ukrainians would be in a position to cut that road. I'm not in a position to comment about this. The latest reports from the Russian side is that there are no Ukrainian troops in Andreevka. It's not clear whether any troops are in fact there, but the Russian Ministry of Defense continues to insist that Ukrainian attacks in the Kleshchayevka area have been repelled. And I would say that in this particular part of the battlefront, particularly in the Bakhmut area, fighting does tend to be extremely fluid. There are advances by each side, then there are counterattacks, soldiers get pushed back. Maybe this is a more threatening Ukrainian advance, who's to say? And it would be consistent to some extent with claims that were made by the Russian commentator Yuri Podolyaka that I discussed yesterday in my video yesterday, that the Ukrainians are now finally making some gains, some very, in territorial terms, very minor gains in the fight around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, in the fight, in other words, in the Bakhmut area. I would say that according to Slavyangrad, in the area between Andreevka and Klesheyevka, forces from the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, in other words, Chechen fighters, are particularly heavily concentrated. I suspect that this fight is far from concluded, and I go back to what Podolyaka was saying yesterday. It's just possible, especially if Klesheyevka is recaptured, that the Ukrainians will be able to re-enter Artyomovsk, which is, by the way, now essentially deserted in some places. But at the very best, or at the very worst from a Russian point of view, their offensive will eventually exhaust itself once it reaches the Bakhmutka River, which bisects Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, in two. Well, we'll see what happens, but for the moment there is a lot of talk about this on the internet. There's a lot of chatter on the Telegram channels. I've seen lots of chatter at various times about fighting in and around the Bakhmut area. It's clear, as I've discussed many times, that because of the relatively recent fall of Bakhmut, it was only captured by the Russians in May. The Russians have never been able to fully consolidate in Bakhmut. They've not been able to put down deep defenses there. But at the same time, and I have to say this, I think that for the Ukrainians to persist with this battle of Bakhmut, looks more like a fixation than a clearly thought out act of strategy. It compounds Ukrainian losses. It diverts Ukrainian troops from what I would have thought were more important battlefronts. The one in the north, especially, where the Russians are now advancing kilometers at a time. And if you still believe in the offensive in the south, it diverts Ukrainian forces from that offensive also in the south. So I can't really see much of the purpose for this. But anyway, that's the news on that part of the battlefronts. Now, there is other important news, which is that relating to, in terms of the actual conduct of the war, which relates to the kind of fighting that is now taking place, or rather the kind of long-range strikes that each side is trying to conduct against the other. Ukraine, about 2 days ago, launched another attempted drone strike against Moscow. It doesn't seem to have done any significant damage. One building, one sort of high-rise building in Moscow, a civilian building, saw a collision by a drone, a Ukrainian drone, which did some damage to about 3 floors of the building. There's some rather dramatic pictures of this. Interestingly, nobody seems to have been killed. I gather this attack happened at night. The Russians say that none of the drones reached their targets. None of the drones that attacked Moscow reached their targets. They were either shot down by Moscow's air defenses, or in most cases, they were brought down by electronic jamming. And this, I have to say, is another one of those pinprick attacks that Ukraine carries out from time to time. It's clearly intended more for theatrical effect than for any actual gain. Is suggestions that the drone that hit the building and did the damage to the building was actually intended to strike at the Russian Defense Ministry, but it's clear it didn't get anywhere close to it. Who's to say? But this is a pinprick attack of no military significance, and I think by now, whatever propaganda claim Ukraine once obtained by launching attacks of this sort in Moscow, a propaganda claim which, in my opinion, was questionable anyway, and which might, on the contrary, explain why so many Russian men are now volunteering to join the army. Anyway, whatever propaganda effect these sort of attacks have, it appears to have largely worn off. There have been rather more sustained Ukrainian strikes on Crimea, and these seem to have happened over several days. And importantly and interestingly, they involve the use of British Storm Shadow missiles. So about 2 nights ago, Ukraine launched missile strikes with British Storm Shadow missiles against what appears to have been an ammunition dump and a training ground on Crimea. Both Storm Shadow missiles appear to have got through, and there was a fire, and at the training ground, and I understand that I recall that Putin actually was concerned enough about it to have a discussion about this particular attack at the level of the Russian Security Council. And then last night there was actually a bigger Ukrainian attack, very complex attack, or at least an attempt to undertake a complex attack, to some extent copying Russian tactics, a large attack with a big drone swarm. Some people say that up to 30 drones were involved, and 4 Storm Shadow missiles. And apparently all 4 Storm Shadow missiles got through and hit their targets, which again were largely ammunition dumps and those kind of things. Now, all of this is embarrassing for the Russians, and it might to some extent complicate their logistics, though I doubt to any very significant degree. It is not comparable in anything like the scale to the kind of attacks that Ukraine was succeeding in launching in the late summer and early autumn of last year, with HIMARS missiles against Russian logistical infrastructure. Though I would say that claims about that damage made at the time by Ukraine and in the Western media, were exaggerated, and the Russians quickly adapted to the problem caused by the HIMARS missiles, as even Western media today largely acknowledges. But anyway, these attacks by Storm Shadow missiles on Crimea are worrying, and they will concern the Russians. And of course, already there's some speculation that these attacks are somehow intended to disrupt Russian logistics and supplies on the eve of some other big offensive that Ukraine might be planning to launch in the south. But on the first point, I suspect that before long the Russians will have worked out how to deal with these attacks. They've shown that they are effective in bringing down drones. They've also managed to bring down a lot of Storm Shadow missiles. The number of Storm Shadow missiles Ukraine has been supplied with is probably depleting anyway, and I gather that these missiles are no longer in production. So this is a problem that the Russians will no doubt, I'm sure, will find a solution to, and which they can weather. In any event, these attacks on Crimea and the attack on Moscow are dwarfed by the attacks which the Russians are now carrying out and are continuing to carry out with missiles in southern Ukraine, in the Odessa, Nikolaev area, and the Russians have now carried out major missile strikes on a Ukrainian port city located right on the Romanian border. One particular Russian missile actually appears to have landed within 500 meters of the Romanian border. And it is clear that the Russians are now systematically targeting Ukraine's ability to export foodstuffs, grain. There's been some talk about Ukraine trying to export grain from some of these Black Sea ports, moving down the Romanian coast, the Romanian and Bulgarian coast, out of reach of the Russians. Well, the Russians are making absolutely certain that that can't happen. They're attacking Ukrainian facilities in these particular ports, and they're also threatening a bridge over which trains carrying grain would have to cross if they were to travel along the coastline, along the Black Sea coastline of Romania and Bulgaria, in order to reach potential customers. Now, I have to say, again, these attacks illustrate once more the principle in war that you may, at the outset, set yourself all sorts of parameters, all sorts of limits on what you're prepared to do, but the imperative of war pushes you to escalate and eventually to break through those parameters. In the spring and early summer of last year, the Russians were saying that they had not placed any kind of obstacles on the export by Ukraine of food products. And on the 2nd of July of last year, they entered into an agreement, a grain agreement, allowing Ukraine to export its grain. Now they're making absolutely sure that that the Ukrainians are not able to export grain. And it's perhaps understandable, but it's fully understandable why the Ukrainians are outraged by this. And it's not surprising also if there's been a lot of criticism of these actions by the Russians from various sources in the West. The Russians, who are about to host a major Africa-Russia summit, I believe in St. Petersburg, I gather Putin is gearing up to address the participants even as I speak, has reassured the Africans that he will be providing, that Russia is able to provide grain for free, fully compensating for any lost grain from Ukraine. Concluding this summary of the most recent events on the battlefield, there's been more reports of another attack on a Russian surveillance vessel. I believe its name is the Ivan Kotov, by Ukrainian seaborne drones. Apparently, the drones were destroyed by the ship's defense systems. There were apparently 2 drones used. One was destroyed, according to the Russians, 1,000 meters from the ship. Another was destroyed slightly closer at 800 meters. The relevance of that particular episode is that Ukraine is still apparently able to launch these drones, and one wonders for how much longer, given the sustained Russian attack on Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Now, I've already discussed how the cut-off of grain is going to affect the Ukrainian economy. I've also said that there is an uncertainty about what the Russian plans ultimately towards Odessa are. whether these missile strikes on Odessa and the surrounding ports are a precursor for some kind of Russian attack intended to capture Odessa. I don't think we are anywhere closer to answering those questions for the moment, or that question for the moment. We shall just have to wait and see. So anyway, that's my summary of the situation on the front lines for the time being. Now, there have been some rather interesting developments, and first of all, just to complete Ukrainian news, or at least news about the war in Ukraine, I alluded in a recent program to an interview with a Russian general on, I believe it's Russia 1 television station, on Russian television, in which this Russian general, who is, as it turns out, actually serving on the front lines. In other words, he's not a retired general at all, as I initially thought. He's actually an active army general participating in the war. Anyway, that this particular general said that he expected that the offensive that Ukraine is conducting will begin to peter out sometime around the end of August. Well, I've now got an awful lot more news about that particular interview. And the first thing to say is that the general in question who was interviewed was none other than General Mudvichev, who is the commander of the Russian Central Military District and of the Center Group, which is one of the major military formations participating in the fighting in the conflict area. And Mordvichev, by the way, is one of those generals who have been variously reported by Ukraine and or by the Western media, well, definitely by the Western media, as having been killed over the course of this conflict. Well, he's obviously not been killed. He is very much alive, and he's just given this interview. And I would say that it's important. This fact in itself ought to serve as an important warning against any claims by the West about, or indeed Ukraine, about the deaths of senior Russian military officers. In more cases than not, those claims have subsequently turned out to be wrong, and this instance of General Mudvichev giving an interview, turning up alive and providing information about the progress of the war ought to serve as a warning of this. And if the Western media and Western reports and Ukrainian reports get the issue of whether Russian generals are alive or dead wrong, one should also be careful about accepting their other claims about the status of Russian generals. People like General Surovikin, for example, who's still not appeared on the battlefront, on the media, but who there is no information or evidence to suggest that he's in any sort of serious trouble, despite some reports that we have read. Anyway, just saying. Now, General Mudvichev has clearly been authorized by the Russian Ministry of Defense to give this interview. It is most unusual for a general of this rank and this importance, one who is actually actively commanding troops in the area of the special military operation, to give an interview to the media, even the Russian media. Russian generals tend to be extremely media averse. They're clearly under orders not to provide interviews with the media. In this, by the way, they stand in stark contrast to Ukrainian generals, with Zaluzhny and Syrsky often speaking to the Western media and having their interviews published. So the fact that Mordvichev is giving an interview he's clearly been authorized to do it, and what he says almost certainly does come with some sort of agreement or consent, or has been cleared by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, there is an interview, there's a video circulating of this interview. I should say that the subtitles are a machine translation. I'm going to instead go to Simplicius the Thinker's blog piece about this interview on his Substack blog, because I think that summarizes it pretty well. So this is how Simplicius the Thinker summarizes Mordvichev's interview. And he says this: he, that is to say Mordvichev, confidently states that the AFU offensive, in other words, Ukrainian offensive, will peter out by August. Then there will be a big pause during which they won't accomplish anything, including over the course of the winter. He finishes with a prediction that the war will end by spring. Of course, and this is now Simplicius the Thinker, the big question is, what will Russia do afterwards? And when asked, Mordvichev appears to demur in a way I can only assume is simply professional silence, in that he obviously doesn't want to give Russia's own offensive plans away. But it is very enticingly insightful that one of the top army group commanders of the SMO believes the war will be over by spring. What could possibly give him such confidence? On the one hand, it's clear he must be speaking on the basis of the disastrously unsustainable losses the Ukrainian military is experiencing, and must further know that NATO doesn't have much armour and heavy weapons left to send, not to mention ammunition. And then Simplicius the Thinker then goes on to say that Mordvichev also actually talked about Ukraine using cluster munitions in a faulty way to no effect against Russian forces. He confirms that cluster munitions are mostly useless and are used only out of desperation. He states that his group alone took 31 prisoners on the day prior to the interview. And then he states that Russia is conducting an active defense whereby it allows Russian forces to maintain certain tactical initiatives and in general be in a position so as to be able to seize the initiative at any given point when so inclined. And he goes on to explain that the current defences will snowball into a sort of cooperation of such initiatives. This is the most interesting part of the interview, which will lead, and this is Simplicius the Thinker's interpretation, which is one I share, which will lead to what we can assume will be an active Russian offensive is on all fronts. He says more time is needed, but that this will happen in the future. So, actually, very interesting interview, and it, to some extent, reminds me a little of what the Chechen commander Abdi Alaudinov said some months ago. This was before Ukraine started its offensive. He said that the offensive would fail, that the Russians would weather the storm, and then he said that after that the initiative would gradually pass to them, and he predicted that the war would continue into 2024, and he said that he thought that the war would finally end with the Ukrainian collapse around August of next year. And that was Abdi Alaudinov's perspective of how the war would ensue. And we see that Modvichinov has something, Modvichev, sorry, has something of the same view. Not exactly the same time frame as Abdialaudinov had, perhaps a slightly tighter time frame. He expects the war to end in the spring rather than in the late summer. That could be because Ukraine's ammunition problems are intensifying more rapidly than the Russians expected. It could be because the severity of Ukrainian losses. It could also be because of the scale of the Russian build-up, which has been faster than anybody perhaps anticipated, both in increases in manpower and in increases in terms of weapons and munitions and those sort of things. But Medvedev is saying that the Ukrainian offensive will continue for some more weeks, about 5 more weeks, but come the end of August, it will basically have run its course. The situation on the front lines will begin to become static and will remain so through much of the autumn. Of course, during a period of the autumn, from late October to early November, we're at the time of the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa, the mud season, which will slow down movement of troops. But he said that in the meantime, wherever there are opportunities, whenever the Ukrainians get weaker on one or other part of the front lines, the Russian commanders have been given authority, given permission to go on the attack themselves and to exploit any advantages that appear. And Medvedev suggests, or this is Simplicus the Thinker's interpretation, and it's also mine, that eventually these local attacks will expand and come together into some kind of cascade effect, a kind of general offensive, at which point the Ukrainian military will start to unravel and will collapse. And he seems to expect that the final collapse, will take place sometime in the spring. Well, that's interesting. That was Medvedev's view. As I said, he's almost certainly had permission from the Russian Defense Ministry to say this. It may be that this is all a part of a Russian deception operation. One shouldn't discount that possibility by any means. But if it is not, then it does give us some idea of how the Russians expect this war to develop. They are not planning big arrow offensives. Instead, what they're going to do is that once the Ukrainian offensive has run its course, they will gradually, steadily, incrementally increase pressure all across the front lines. They will advance wherever the Ukrainians are weak, that the Ukrainians will find themselves increasingly overextended and overstretched. They will suffer more losses in men, machines, ammunition, and eventually their military will collapse as this Russian offensive, these local Russian offensives come together and evolve into an offensive avalanche. So that's the Russian plan, in effect, to win the war through attrition. Not very different, if my historical understanding is correct, of the way in which the Union won the Civil War against the South during the American Civil War of the 1860s. Not a single big knockout blow, but steady pressure applied all across the front lines, especially after General Grant took over command of the Union armies until eventually attrition took its toll and the southern armies collapsed. You could argue, by the way, that that is also essentially how the First World War also ended, with the Germans being worn down by attrition and in the autumn of 1918 also experiencing what was in effect a kind of collapse. So anyway, that is the Russian view. Lots of other things are happening around the world, and some very interesting developments relating to Sergei Shoigu. It's now been confirmed, going to be visiting North Korea very soon. And the Russian news agency TASS has this report. A Russian delegation led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu will visit North Korea on July 25th to 27th to take part in festive events marking the 70th anniversary of North Korea's victory in the Fatherland Liberation War of 1950 to 53. Now that is a rather interesting interpretation of the Korean War. The Korean War is being referred to as, well, the North Koreans no doubt would call it a victory, but most people outside the Korean Peninsula would call it a stalemate. But anyway, the North Koreans are going to celebrate this event, their victory in 1953, a victory won against, obviously, the South Koreans, but the South Koreans at that time backed by the United States and the Western powers. And, of course, North Korea in that conflict was backed by the Soviet Union and by China. So this is the conflict that Shoigu is going to North Korea to participate in the festivities of. And that's, in itself, it seems to me, quite interesting because, of course, the situation has now perhaps changed. It's not North Korea fighting South Korea, North Korea backed by Russia and China versus the West. It's Russia fighting the West in Ukraine, or so Shoigu would say. Russia backed by its friends, China, obviously, to some extent, but also, of course, including North Korea. Anyway, this is the highest level meeting, but rather the highest level visit by a top Russian official to North Korea for a very long time. Putin himself did travel to North Korea shortly after he became Russian president, where he met Kim Jong-il, the present North Korean leader's father, Kim Jong-un's father. This was, I believe, either in 2000 or 2001. It was one of Putin's first foreign visits. There's been quite a lot of contact between North Korea and the Russians since then, and since Kim Jong-un started to pursue a more conciliatory policy towards the South and try to enter into negotiations with Donald Trump, negotiations which ended in failure. Both the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, and the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, have met and hosted Kim Jong-un, but on the territories of their own countries. To my recollection, Putin actually met with Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok. Now, this, however, is a case of Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, traveling to Pyongyang, to North Korea. And why is he going? Well, obviously, at some level, it is in order to express thanks to the outspoken support, verbal support, and to the extent that North Korea is in a position to provide diplomatic support, but anyway, verbal support that North Korea has provided to Russia over the course of this war. But it is difficult to believe that this is only about that. On one level, it's clearly intended to remind everybody that North Korea and Russia have been allies in the past, and that they're friends again, and that they might become allies once more. Now, the Russians are restricted from selling weapons to North Korea, or indeed military technology to North Korea, because of the sanctions that the UN Security Council, with Russia's agreement, passed against North Korea some years ago in protest against North Korea's nuclear weapons program. But I can't help but think that if the defense minister of Russia travels to North Korea, then some level of military cooperation is on the cards. Now, we've heard that the Russians have increased production, shell production, by multiple volumes. They've increased, some reports say that they've increased shell production to around 3 million rounds of ammunition a month. And the most recent report I heard was that they've increased shell ammunition to around 6 million rounds of ammunition a month. Having said that, it's probably still the case that Russia is not producing enough shells, at least not for the moment, to satisfy all its needs on the battlefields out of its own production. Now, the Russians do have very large stockpiles, including very large stockpiles of cluster munitions. They've actually said that the stockpiles of cluster munitions in their possession are substantially greater than those held by the United States. But we don't know exactly how big those stockpiles are. I saw a report that spoke about 10 million rounds, which is an awful lot, and would probably tide them over until the end of the year. Certainly would if some of the production figures we're getting are correct. But it could be that the Russians also want to tap into North Korea's apparently enormous stockpile of shells and its enormous ability to produce shells. North Korea has one of the largest arsenals of artillery in the world, and it has huge numbers of shells and produces huge numbers of shells to keep this enormous artillery force fully supplied. So it could be that is why the Russians, that is why Shoigu is going there. There have been rumors about this in the past. The North Koreans have furiously denied that they're supplying shells to the Russians. But it might be that is partly what this trip is all about. Or it could be that there is another purpose to this visit, which is to scare the South Koreans. The South Koreans have supplied shells, 500,000 shells, to the United States, supposedly on loan. It's widely believed, most probably correctly believed, that some of these shells have been heading towards Ukraine, and it could be that the Russians are, through this visit by Shoigu, quietly reminding the South Koreans that if the South Koreans want to play games with Ukraine, then the Russians can deepen their ties with North Korea in a way that South Korea might not particularly like. So there might be some element of that too. So it's possible that Shoigu is there going to Pyongyang on a quest for shells. One has to ask what Russia, if it is going to North Korea, in quest for shells, if this isn't just, as I said, an attempt either to mend fences with the North Koreans or to put the frighteners up the South Koreans, if they really are looking for shells, what are they going to give the North Koreans in return? Now, North Korea definitely needs economic support, and here the Russians can supply quite a lot. They can help North Korea with food. North Korea often has problems with food, though the years of outright starvation apparently are in the past. Can also help North Korea with fuel. And again, there are UN sanctions that stand in the way, but perhaps something might be done with that too. The Russians could also help North Korea to upgrade its civilian economy, all of which would probably be possible despite the sanctions. But there'd have to be other possibilities as well, though I doubt that the Russians would want to be seen openly violating sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council. When the defense minister of Russia travels to a particular country, it does make one wonder whether perhaps some kind of transfer, perhaps of military technology, might also be on the cards. North Korea has made significant strides in updating its armed forces. It's now developed what looks to be quite a potent nuclear missile force, something that it achieved much more quickly than people in the West anticipated. It also seems to be fielding some form of advanced surface-to-air missile system, but it does remain behind in tank technology. The North Koreans have unveiled a new advanced-looking tank, but we don't yet know whether it's in full service or production, and there may be all kinds of problems with it. There are suspicions that there are. And North Korea is also looking to upgrade its submarine fleet, its surface navy, and, of course, ultimately its air force. Now, it's unlikely, because of the sanctions, that the Russians would necessarily pass on any military equipment to North Korea. They wouldn't want to sell, for example, Sukhoi 35 jets to North Korea. That would be an open breach of the sanctions. But there might be quiet agreements. Also, by the way, they would violate the sanctions, but they might be difficult to keep track of. There might be quiet agreements to transfer technologies. And North Korea, contrary to what many think, does have a significant industrial base. If it's provided with the necessary levels of technical expertise, it could certainly, in my opinion, complete work on building its tank and in developing its submarine force, including, apparently, there's plans by North Korea to develop nuclear submarines. And, of course, it's possible even that this is a much more challenging project, that North Korea might start to develop some form of fighter jet, though whether even with covert Russian support, North Korea could develop a fighter jet comparable to those fielded by South Korea must be a moot question. But anyway, it's interesting that Shoigu is going to North Korea. There's no really satisfactory explanation about why he's going there. The most interesting fact about this visit, however, is that it's taking place in public. I said that no senior Russian official has visited Pyongyang. Well, I ought to correct that. I say no senior Russian official has publicly visited Pyongyang. Quite possibly, senior Russian officials have been to Pyongyang in private, but this is one instance of a very senior Russian official, the defense minister no less, going there publicly in full view to participate in the celebrations of what North Korea claims was a victory, in effect, over the United States. So this is an intriguing event, and one which we'll no doubt find out a lot more about. But what it does show is that through the sanctions war that the United States and its allies launched against Russia, not only has Russia not been broken, but it's now able to re-establish contacts with North Korea. It no longer has to fear sanctions retaliation from the West, because the sanctions weapon from the West is essentially exhausted. And that means that North Korea itself now truly is no longer isolated and out in the cold. I'm going to suggest that, putting aside the question of shells, there's almost certainly been a very intense interaction between the Russians and the North Koreans for some months now. That's probably what lies behind all of these strong North Korean statements expressing support for Russia. And there's probably already been a whole layer of agreements about which we know very little. It is very interesting that over the last few months, the Russians have worked to restore relations with two of their key Cold War allies, Cuba, where there's more reports about the surge in Russian-Cuban trade, and where contacts between Cuba and Russia are now constantly moving up to an ever higher level. Cuba and North Korea, two countries which, after the Cold War, the United States thought it could isolate and pull down through what were in effect tightened economic blockades, but which are now finding that their own old ally, Russia, has come back to support them. Anyway, that's one very interesting event that is taking place. There is another, and it's equally intriguing, and this is confirmation from China that the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang has been dismissed, and that he's been replaced by no less a person than Wang Yi. Wang Yi was, of course, the foreign minister before Qin Gang was appointed foreign minister as recently as December. Wang Yi is a foreign policy veteran. He was then promoted to the rank of a full member of the Politburo, which I believe he will continue to be, and he was placed in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy as an official of the party, supervising the work of the foreign ministry. And then, and it did seem for a time that this relationship, Wang Yi and Qin Gang working together, that they were forming some kind of a team. But then sometime towards the end of June, after meeting with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Rudenko, Qin Gang essentially disappeared. Well, did disappear. There's no word about what had happened to him. And I've noticed over the last couple of days that all the meetings with foreign dignitaries, with foreign visitors, which one would once have expected Qin Gang as foreign minister to be the participant in, will now once again being conducted by Wang Yi. Now, there is no explanation of these events There's no explanation of why Wang Yi, having been replaced as foreign minister by Gang, has now in turn returned to his post and replaced Gang just a few months after Gang had been appointed foreign minister himself. There's no explanation from China as to why this has happened. I haven't seen any sign that Gang, as foreign minister, has done anything which deviates to any extent from the general direction of Chinese foreign policy. And I'm not really going to speculate on the reasons for this decision. But one thing one can say is that from a Russian point of view, the return of Wang Yi is good news. Because Wang Yi, as far as the Russians are concerned, is somebody they know well. He's a friend. He's a personal friend of the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And I think the Russians will be very pleased that they have their old friend Wang Yi back in charge of the Foreign Ministry, and that the Lavrov-Wang Yi partnership has been re-established. For all I know, that the decision to re-establish this partnership might be the reason why the Chinese government has made this decision. It doesn't seem as if Gang is in total disfavor, because the reports about him, the reports about this reshuffle in the Chinese media still seem to refer to him in reasonably respectful terms, though interestingly, there is no word of him being appointed to any new post. So anyway, it's a curious development. I'm not somebody who, I have to say, is terribly interested in these sort of promotions or demotions that governments regularly undertake. But it is interesting that the Chinese authorities have decided to bring back the grizzled veteran Wang Yi, the friend of Lavrov, the person who's taken such a strong line against the US in various international meetings, a person who's widely perceived to be something of a, well, I wouldn't call him a hardliner, but somebody who will defend China's corner with great skill and ability and toughness, and who Western leaders, as a result, find somewhat intimidating. It is interesting that the Chinese have decided to bring him back. Anyway, that's one, again, curious and interesting development. And then I'm going to finish this program by coming back to another important country, India, and a former Indian diplomat, M.K. Bhadrakumar, has written a very interesting piece for his blog, Indian Punchline, which, by the way, ought to be essential reading for anybody who wants to keep track of the direction of international affairs. Bhadrakumar is one of the most insightful commentators around, and as a former diplomat, he understands the diplomatic game far better than most people who write about diplomacy do. And it is a most interesting piece. He makes the point that there is a realization today that the war, I'm quoting from him now, is actually between Russia and NATO, and that Ukraine has ceased to be a sovereign country since 2014, when the CIA and sister Western agencies, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Sweden, installed and he doesn't mention Poland there, but of course Poland is included, installed a puppet regime in Kiev. Interesting choice of words from Bhadrakumar, by the way. Puppet regime in Kiev. a regime change in Kiev, which he attributes to the work of the CIA. And that's Badrakuma saying this. And then he also says that the fog of war is lifting and the battle lines are becoming visible. At an authoritative level, a candid discussion is beginning as regards the end game. And then he talks a lot about the meeting between Putin and Lukashenko, and he goes on to say that the meeting between Putin and Lukashenko and the Security Council meeting in which Putin spoke about the risk of war with Poland, he goes on to say there is no question that these two events were carefully choreographed by Kremlin officials and intended to convey multiple messages. Russia exudes confidence that it has achieved dominance on the battlefront, having thrashed the Ukrainian military and Kiev's counteroffensive moving into the rearview mirror. But Moscow anticipates that the Biden administration may be having an even bigger war plan in mind. And then Badrakuma analyzes or discusses very thoroughly all these concerns that I've talked about in previous programs about war, possible war between Belarus and Russia, between Poland and Russia, if Poland finds itself involved in a war in Belarus. And in a program where I discussed the meeting between Lukashenko and Putin, I said that it seemed to me at that time that Lukashenko had said that the incorporation or occupation of Western Ukraine by Poland would be unacceptable to Belarus. And I said that the translation wasn't entirely clear, at least I didn't have a proper translation at that time. The Kremlin has now published a translation, and it is clear indeed that Lukashenko did indeed say exactly that. Lukashenko went further than Putin. He said that this is unacceptable to us, the alienation of Western Ukraine, the dismemberment of Ukraine and the transfer of its lands to Poland are unacceptable. Should people in Western Ukraine ask us, then we will provide support to them. In other words, if Poland marches into Western Ukraine, if people in Western Ukraine oppose it and seek support from Belarus, Belarus will come to their aid. And always be aware that in these kind of situations, it's always possible to find someone in a place like Western Ukraine who might be persuaded to invite the Belarusians in order to repel Poland. And then Lukashenko went on to say, and these are Lukashenko's words, and this is from the Kremlin translation, I ask you, in other words Putin, to discuss and think about this issue. Naturally, I would like you to support us in this regard if the need of such support arises. If Western Ukraine asks us for help, then we will provide assistance and support to people in Western Ukraine. If this happens, we will support them in every way. So I'm asking you to discuss this issue and think it through. Obviously, I would like you to support us in this regard. With this support, and if Western Ukraine asks for this help, we will definitely provide assistance and support to the population of Western Ukraine. So, Lukashenko is laying the battle lines. He's saying, Putin previously, the day before, said if Ukraine transfers Western Ukraine to Poland, well, it's not our business. But his ally, his key ally, Lukashenko, has said, perhaps so, but it is Belarus's business. It is our concern. We might easily find ourselves in a war over Poland about this, and if so, we would like your support. And Badrakuma unlike virtually everybody in the West, very rightly takes this a lot more seriously than Western commentators has done. And he says the bottom line is that Putin and Lukashenko held such a discussion publicly at all. And this is important to stress. The Kremlin didn't need to publish either a video or a transcript of all of this discussion. But they did. And Mercouris says clearly both spoke on the basis of intelligence inputs. They anticipate an inflection point ahead. And it is one thing that the Russian people are well aware that their country is de facto fighting NATO in Ukraine, but it is an entirely different matter that the war may dramatically escalate to a war with Poland, a NATO army that the US regards as its most important partner in continental Europe. And then Mercouris expresses doubts about whether Poland is really in a position to take on the Russian army. He points out that Poland must be dithering too. According to Politico, Poland's military is about 150,000 strong, of which 30,000 belong to a new territorial defense force who are weekend soldiers who undergo 16 days of training, followed up by refresher courses. And he wonders whether it is really feasible for Poland to really involve itself in a conflict with Russia over Western Ukraine. But then Mercouris makes the point that Putin's back-to-back meetings in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Security Council session, and the meeting with Lukashenko throw light on the Russian thinking as to key elements of the endgame. In Ukraine, first, Russia has no intentions of territorial conquest of Western Ukraine, but will insist on having a say on how the new boundaries of the country and the future regime will look and act like, which means that an anti-Russian state will not be allowed. Second, the Biden administration's plan to snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat is a non-starter, as Russia will not hesitate to counter any continued attempt by the United States and NATO to use Ukrainian territory as a springboard to wage a renewed proxy war, which means that Ukraine's piecemeal absorption into NATO will remain a fantasy. In other words, this Putin-Lukashenko discussion is in effect Putin and Lukashenko saying that the incorporation of Western Ukraine into Russia and into Poland and its conversion into in effect NATO territory is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. And then Mercouris finishes by saying, third, most important, the battle-hardened Russian army, backed by a powerful defense industry and a robust economy, will not hesitate to confront NATO member countries bordering Ukraine if they trespass on Russia's core interests, which means that Russia's core interests will not be held hostage to Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So, what Mercouris is saying is that if NATO tries to expand into any part of Ukraine, even by stealth through some kind of incorporation of Western Ukraine into Poland, the Russians are guaranteed to oppose it. That's what that exchange of discussions, words between Putin and Lukashenko points towards. And the Russian military will not stand idly by, and they will not be deterred by NATO's Article 5 commitment, because for the Russians, it remains an existential matter. So that's Brad Kuma's assessment, and I think he is right. I think Poland involving itself in Western Ukraine is playing with fire, and if there are plans being hatched in Washington and Warsaw to go down this route, then they're playing an extremely dangerous game. They've been now given strong warnings not to go there, and I hope that good sense will prevail. By the way, in October, Poland has elections. We will see who wins. I hope that whichever party does win, they will start to moderate the stance Poland has been taking in this war up to now, and that we will see, as I said, a more rational policy followed from this point on. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and getting yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.